I still remember the first time I set foot in Big Bend National Park, long before anyone whispered the name of Ranger Hale with that mix of fear and reverence. The land out here isn't like any other stretch of wilderness in the United States. It isn't the soft, rolling forests of the East or the snow-bright passes of the Rockies. Big Bend is harsh, dry, and eternal, an expanse where jagged mountains slice the horizon and the desert floor bakes beneath an indifferent sun. It's the kind of place that humbles a man, strips him of illusions, and dares him to survive on its own terms. I came here a decade ago, restless from city life, chasing something I couldn't quite name, and I stayed because the desert spoke to me in a language older than memory. I had met other rangers in my time, men and women who took their duty seriously, but none like Hale. He had been with the park longer than most of us, knew the canyons and dry washes as if they were veins in the palm of his own hand. He was the type of ranger who could track a cougar across rock without a single print to follow, who could glance at a shifting sky and tell you if a flash flood was coming hours before the first drop of rain. For many of us younger rangers, he was more than a colleague. He was a mentor, a man who carried the weight of the park on his shoulders as though it were an old friend instead of a burden. Hale wasn't a loud man, not the kind to dominate a room with his presence, but when he spoke, you listened. His voice carried the slow, measured rhythm of someone who had spent years alone in the desert, learning patience from the silence. I remember evenings at the ranger station, the four of us sitting on the porch after a long day of patrols, watching the sun sink behind the Chizos Mountains. Hale would sit with a battered enamel mug of coffee in his hands, eyes fixed on the burning horizon, and he'd start telling stories. Not the kind you read in guidebooks, not the polished facts about geology or history, but tales he'd picked up from old ranchers, smugglers, and ghost towns swallowed by sand. He'd tell of miners who vanished in the Sierra Quemada, of strange lights seen flickering above desert mesas, of travelers who walked into canyons and never came out. We'd laugh nervously, tell ourselves it was just desert lore, but I think we all knew there was truth woven into his words. Big Bend has a way of swallowing men whole, and Hale seemed to understand that better than anyone. The last time I saw him alive was an ordinary morning in late September. The sun had only just cleared the horizon, painting the desert in bruised shades of pink and gold. We were gathered in the operations room, dividing up our patrol routes for the day. Hale had been assigned to the southern boundary, near Santa Elena Canyon, a stretch notorious for its remoteness. He didn't complain, he never did. He just nodded, adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, and slipped his revolver into its worn leather holster. That revolver, standard issue, 6 chambers, polished from years of use, was as much a part of him as his boots. I never once saw him without it, though I doubted he had ever fired it outside of practice. Hale had a way of calming situations with words before bullets were ever needed. That morning, he gave me a small nod, the kind that carried 1,000 unsaid things, and then he was gone. I thought little of it then. A man like Hale belonged in the desert. But as the hours dragged into evening and his radio stayed silent, unease began to coil in my gut. We launched a search before midnight, a dozen of us combing the arroyos and ridges with flashlights and flares. The desert at night is a different creature, cold, vast, and echoing with unseen life. Coyotes called from the distance, their cries mocking our efforts, while the wind carried whispers through the Ocotillo and Mesquite. We found no sign of Hale. No tracks, no dropped gear, no indication of struggle. It was as if the desert had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Days turned into weeks, and the search expanded, drawing in helicopters, dogs, and volunteers. We mapped every canyon, every dry wash, every hollow where a man might have sought shade or shelter. Nothing. The desert yielded nothing. The official report, filed after 30 fruitless days, listed him as missing, presumed dead. But among ourselves, we never accepted that. Hale was too skilled, too careful, too attuned to the rhythms of the wild to simply vanish. Something else had happened, something we couldn't name. 2 years passed, and though the desert carried on indifferent to our loss, I couldn't shake the weight of his absence. I'd walk the same patrol routes he once did, feel the silence pressing harder in places he used to linger, and wonder if he had left some unseen trace. I'd catch myself listening for his voice on the radio, half expecting him to call in with one of his dry observations about the weather or the movement of wildlife. But there was only silence. His disappearance became another story whispered among the rangers, another cautionary tale folded into the fabric of Big Bend. And then, just when we had begun to let the memory settle into the dust, a discovery was made that ripped open every wound we thought had closed. It was early spring, the desert just beginning to shrug off the brittle grip of winter. A pair of hikers had strayed from the marked trail near the cliffs overlooking the Rio Grande. They stumbled into a rocky hollow, a place even we rangers rarely tread, and there, half buried beneath a scatter of stones and mesquite roots, they found Hale's service revolver. The leather holster was cracked and sun-bleached, the steel dulled by 2 years of sand and heat, but it was unmistakably his. More unsettling than its condition, though, was the fact that the weapon was empty. Every chamber, once meticulously loaded, had been spent. No spent casings were found nearby, no signs of target practice, no evidence of a firefight. Just the revolver, alone in the dirt, as if it had been placed there deliberately. When the call came in, I was among the first to arrive at the site. I remember standing over that revolver, my own reflection warped in its tarnished steel, and feeling the desert close in around me. A silence hung in the air, thicker than anything I'd known before, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The other rangers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale in the glare of the sun. For 2 years, we had wondered what fate had befallen Hale. Now, with this single object, we were given more questions than answers. Why had he fired his weapon? At what? And why was it left behind, abandoned in a place he would never have chosen for camp or cover? I picked up the revolver with gloved hands, the weight of it familiar yet foreign. My mind raced back to that last morning, the nod he gave me, the silent promise in his eyes. I tried to imagine the circumstances that could drive a man like Hale to fire all 6 rounds in the heart of the desert. Wild animals? Smugglers? Something else, something unseen? The possibilities spiraled, each more unsettling than the last. But as the sun beat down on us and the wind hissed through the canyon grass, one thought refused to leave me. The desert doesn't give up its dead easily, but when it does, it always demands a price. Hale had paid his, and now it was up to us to discover what had really happened in the silence of Big Bend. The revolver's discovery shook the foundation of our small ranger community, but for me, it was more than a mystery. It was a wound that refused to close. I had looked up to Hale like an older brother, and even after 2 years of silence, I hadn't been ready to believe he was gone. Now, holding the cold weight of his empty sidearm, I felt a grim certainty settle into my bones. Something had happened out here, something violent, deliberate, and unnatural. From that day forward, I couldn't walk the desert trails the same way. Every jagged ridge seemed to hold secrets. Every canyon felt like a trap waiting to close. Even the silence felt heavier, pressing down on me as if daring me to ask the questions no one else wanted answered. And I did ask, over and over, until the questions became an obsession. Some of the other rangers cautioned me to let it go, to accept that Hale had fallen victim to the same dangers that had claimed countless others in this unforgiving wilderness. But I couldn't. Hale was no ordinary ranger. He didn't make rookie mistakes, didn't wander unprepared, didn't leave traces of panic or confusion. No, what happened to him wasn't chance. I began to retrace his last known route, hiking alone along the southern boundary near Santa Elena Canyon, the place where he'd last checked in on the radio. The canyon itself is a cathedral of stone, walls rising 1,500 feet above the Rio Grande, casting shadows that linger like the memory of storms. Standing there, I could almost see him, wide-brimmed hat tilted low, boots crunching against the gravel, revolver at his side. The thought made my chest tighten. I moved carefully, scanning for signs the original search teams might have missed, scuffs on the rock, remnants of campfires, scraps of fabric, but the desert was as clean and merciless as ever. 2 years of wind and sand had erased everything but the land itself. Still, I pressed on, convinced that if Hale had left any trace of his struggle, it would be hidden in these cliffs. And though I didn't find his body, I did find something else, something that unsettled me far more than bones. In a narrow cleft at the base of the canyon, I came across a cluster of odd markings etched into the rock. At first, I thought they were natural striations, the kind the wind sometimes carves into sandstone. But when I ran my gloved hand over them, I realized they were deliberate. Crude symbols, scratched deep with a sharp edge. Circles intersected with lines, jagged spirals, and a crude figure resembling a man with outstretched arms. They weren't the kind of markings hikers left behind, and they didn't match the pictographs of the ancient tribes who once roamed this land. These were newer, rawer, desperate. My pulse quickened as I crouched closer, brushing away dust to reveal more. One of the circles had 6 smaller notches carved inside it, as though someone had been counting. 6 rounds, 6 chambers. My stomach turned cold. I reported the markings to my supervisor, but the response was tepid. "Probably smugglers," he said, waving it off. "They carve signs to mark routes, warn each other off, that kind of thing. Nothing new out here." But I knew smugglers had chased them across these same canyons before. They used coded symbols, yes, but not like this. Not with spirals and crude human figures that carried a sense of ritual rather than direction. And smugglers didn't linger long enough to carve into stone. They moved quickly, silently, leaving only footprints in the sand. Whatever these markings were, they didn't belong to smuggling routes. They belonged to something else. Something that had held Hale's attention long enough for him to draw his revolver and fire until it was empty. That night, back at the ranger station, I couldn't sleep. The desert wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and sage, but beneath that was something else, an unease that seemed to crawl beneath my skin. I thought of Hale's last patrol, the nod he gave me, the way his revolver now lay empty and abandoned. I thought of the symbols, crude yet deliberate, etched into the canyon like a message left for anyone brave or foolish enough to read. And I thought of the silence. Hale had always said the desert speaks in silence, that if you listen long enough, it tells you things you don't want to hear. Lying in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, I finally understood what he meant. Over the next few weeks, I returned to that canyon again and again, each time venturing deeper, following trails the search teams had long since abandoned. My fellow rangers began to whisper that I was losing myself, that Hale's disappearance had dug too deep into my mind. Maybe they were right. I spent hours crouched by those markings, sketching them into my notebook, trying to decode their meaning. Sometimes, I thought I could almost hear Hale's voice in the whisper of the wind, urging me forward. Other times, I felt watched, as though unseen eyes tracked me from the cliffs. Once, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the canyon floor, I heard what sounded like gunshots echoing in the distance, 6 sharp cracks carried by the wind. My heart pounded as I gripped my own revolver, scanning the ridges, but nothing moved. No smoke, no figures, no evidence of gunfire. Just silence, deep and suffocating. The more I searched, the more the desert seemed to change around me. Trails I knew by heart twisted into unfamiliar shapes. Landmarks appeared different under the shifting light, as though the terrain itself was conspiring to disorient me. I marked my route carefully, but still I found myself circling back to the same clefts, the same clusters of symbols. It was as though the canyon was pulling me toward something, some hidden center I had yet to reach. My obsession grew, and with it, my sense of unease. I began to dream of Hale, his face gaunt and weathered, his revolver drawn as he fired into darkness I couldn't see. In the dreams, the echoes of his shots lingered long after the muzzle flash faded, reverberating like thunder in a sky without clouds. And always, just before I woke, I'd hear his voice, low and strained, whispering words I couldn't quite catch. One evening, after a long patrol, I sat alone on the station porch, staring out at the endless desert. The sky was painted with streaks of crimson and violet, The kind of beauty that feels almost cruel in a place that hides so much death. In my hand, I held Hale's revolver, still bagged as evidence, but entrusted to me for further inspection. I'd cleaned it carefully, polished the dull metal until it gleamed again, but no amount of scrubbing could erase the weight of its history. 6 rounds fired, 6 unknown targets. I raised it slightly, sighting along its barrel at the horizon, and tried to imagine what Hale had seen when he pulled that trigger. Something had been out there, something real enough to make him expend every bullet he carried. Whatever it was, it hadn't left a trace we could find. And that thought chilled me more than anything else. I knew then that I couldn't let this go, no matter the cost. Hale had walked into the silence of Big Bend and never returned. Now his revolver had found its way back, a breadcrumb on a trail that led deeper into the unknown. If the desert demanded a price, then I was willing to pay it. I would follow the path he left behind, step for step, symbol for symbol, until I uncovered the truth. Whether that truth lay in smugglers, ghosts, or something far older and darker than either, I could no longer turn away. Because Hale deserved more than silence. He deserved to be found, one way or another. The weeks that followed blurred into one long stretch of dust, silence, and restless nights. I began documenting everything, filling my notebook with sketches of the symbols I found and detailed accounts of where I'd seen them. Each time I ventured into Santa Elena Canyon, I seemed to uncover more, etched into stones, scratched along cliff faces, even carved into the weathered trunks of mesquite trees. They weren't random. The placement felt intentional, as though leading somewhere. Some of the markings repeated, spirals with 6 notches, circles intersected by jagged lines, while others grew stranger, more complex, forming patterns I couldn't decipher. I started pinning maps across the wall of my small quarters at the ranger station, marking each symbol's location with red ink. Slowly, a crude trail began to emerge, zigzagging through the canyon in a way that made no practical sense for smugglers or hikers. It was like a puzzle half-finished, each piece daring me to step further into its trap. My fellow rangers noticed my obsession, and their patience thinned with each passing day. At first, they tolerated my late-night scribbling, my early morning patrols that stretched longer than scheduled. But when I began taking extra supplies without logging them, they started to push back. "You're chasing shadows," one of them told me, shaking his head. "Hale's gone and the desert's got him. You keep looking, it'll get you too." I wanted to argue, to tell him that Hale wasn't the kind of man to simply vanish without leaving some kind of answer, but I bit my tongue. Words weren't enough anymore. Only proof would silence their doubts. Only discovery would explain the revolver, the empty chambers, the symbols carved into the stone. On one of my longer treks into the canyon, I came across something that made my heart freeze. Tucked beneath an overhang of rock, shielded from wind and weather, lay a strip of fabric, faded, torn, and ground into the dirt. I brushed it free and felt my chest tighten. It was a fragment of khaki cloth, the same material as the standard ranger uniforms. I held it in my hands, trembling. Could it be Hale's? After 2 years, it was possible it had belonged to someone else, but deep down I knew. This canyon had swallowed only one ranger I knew of, and now it was spitting back fragments like a cruel tease. I slipped the cloth into my pack, heart pounding with both dread and exhilaration. Proof. Finally, proof that Hale had been here, that his final steps had taken him deeper into the canyon than the official searches had reached. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. When I did drift off, I dreamed of the canyon, of standing before a wall covered entirely in the strange markings, each symbol glowing faintly with pale light. In the dream, I reached out to touch one, and as my fingers brushed the stone, I heard 6 gunshots echoing around me. The sound rattled through my bones, and in the last flash of the dream, I saw Hale standing at the center of the wall, revolver raised, eyes hollow, mouth open as if trying to speak. But no words came, only silence. I woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering, and when I looked at the wall of my quarters, my maps and sketches loomed back at me in the darkness like an accusation. The desert wasn't just calling me, it was consuming me, just as it had consumed him. Despite the warnings of my colleagues, I doubled my efforts. I extended my patrols, often staying out long past my scheduled return. I brought extra water, extra ammunition, and a compass I checked more often than my own pulse. The desert is not forgiving, and it tests men in ways no other place can. I knew the risks: dehydration, disorientation, heat stroke. Any of these could end me before I ever found what I was searching for. But every time I thought of turning back, I felt Hale's absence pressing me onward. It was as though he was out there still, waiting, urging me to follow his trail, to uncover the truth he had died pursuing. On my fourth extended trek, I found something that nearly broke me. At the base of a narrow gorge, half hidden beneath layers of rockfall, I discovered the remnants of a campsite. A fire pit, long cold. A rusted tin cup. Scraps of canvas eaten away by time and weather. I crouched beside it, brushing the ashes between my fingers, feeling the brittle remnants crumble. My throat went dry. This was no ordinary campsite, it was Hale's. I recognized the cup, dented on one side, the same one he had used countless nights on the porch of the station. My chest tightened painfully. He had been here, alone, trapped between the cliffs and whatever had driven him to fire his revolver until it clicked empty. But the campsite held more than relics. Carved into a stone near the fire pit were more of the symbols, deeper this time, almost frantic in their execution. Spirals overlapping spirals, the figure with outstretched arms now drawn with jagged lines across its chest. And beneath it, scratched in block letters, "Listen." I stared at the word until my vision blurred, the weight of it pressing into me like a command. Listen. To what? The desert wind? The silence? To Hale himself, echoing across the void of time? My hands shook as I traced the letters, my breath shallow. Whatever he had faced here, it hadn't been smugglers. It hadn't been animals. It was something else entirely. As I packed up the fragments of his camp and began the trek back, the canyons seemed to close around me. The shadows deepened, the air grew colder, and for the first time since I began my search, I felt genuine fear. Not of being lost or dying of thirst, but of what I might find if I kept going. Yet even in that fear, I knew I couldn't stop. Hale's revolver had fired 6 times. His camp bore desperate carvings. His trail wasn't finished, and neither was mine. The desert had demanded a price from him, and I was beginning to suspect it had chosen me as the next in line. By the time I returned to the ranger station with the fragments of Hale's camp, I had crossed a line that I couldn't come back from. My fellow rangers could see it in my eyes, the sleepless glaze, the twitch of my hands as I sorted through the scraps like a prospector searching for gold. They asked questions I barely answered. Where had I found the items? How far off the map trails had I gone? Why hadn't I radioed and when I stayed out longer than scheduled? I gave them half-truths and vague descriptions, knowing full well that if I told them the depth of my obsession, they'd strip me of patrol duties altogether. But I couldn't stop now. Hale's story had grown into my story, and the desert had wound our fates together with cruel precision. I cleaned the tin cup until it shone dully under the station lights. I set the fabric scrap beside it on my desk. I pored over the sketches of symbols, drawing them again and again until they haunted the inside of my eyelids when I closed my eyes. And that one word, listen, seemed to hum at the edge of my hearing even in silence, as though the desert itself had spoken through Hale's trembling hand. The following days were restless. I'd find myself drifting outside at odd hours, standing under the vast Texas sky, listening. The wind through the Ocotillo, the scrape of stone against stone, the distant cry of coyotes, all of it carried weight now, as if each sound might conceal a message. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps behind me, crunching on gravel, but when I spun around there was only emptiness. Other times, I thought I caught Hale's voice, a low murmur on the breeze, yet I could never make out the words. The more I tried to decipher the silence, the less it felt like silence at all. It was a presence, thick and steady, pressing against my skull like unseen hands. I didn't tell the others. They already suspected my sanity was fraying, and I didn't need to give them more reason to sideline me. Instead, I took to walking alone, deeper into the desert with every patrol, letting the vast emptiness swallow me whole. It was during one of those solitary treks, under a blistering noon sun, that I found the second camp. Smaller than the first, almost makeshift. A crude lean-to built from mesquite branches. The remains of another fire, this one surrounded by stones that bore fresh carvings. My pulse quickened as I crouched beside them, tracing the symbols with my fingers. They were the same spirals and jagged figures, but this time there were words scratched deeper into the stone. They are listening. My throat went dry. Who were they? Smugglers? Spirits? Something else entirely? The message chilled me more than the symbols ever had because it wasn't just a command, it was a warning. I stared at the words until the edges blurred, then forced myself to tear my gaze away. I didn't know if Hale had written it, but if he had, then his final days in this canyon weren't just marked by desperation. They were marked by paranoia. I camped at that site overnight, though I barely slept. The wind moaned through the canyon walls like a dirge, and the shadows stretched long and menacing across the ground. Every creak of the lean-to, every whisper of sand against rock, jolted me awake with a cold certainty that I wasn't alone. My hand hovered over my revolver more often than not, finger brushing the worn grip. At one point, just before dawn, I swore I heard the crack of a gunshot echo through the canyon. My blood ran cold, my breath caught. I sat there, rigid, waiting for the next sound. None came, only silence. And yet, I knew it hadn't been a dream. The echo was too sharp, too real. 6 shots had rung out 2 years ago, and now their ghosts seemed to be replaying themselves for me one by one. Back at the station, I tried to share my findings with the others, but their skepticism was a wall I couldn't break through. They humored me at first, nodding politely as I laid out the artifacts, the maps, the sketches of the symbols. But when I spoke of the words carved into stone, of the gunshots I'd heard in the night, their faces closed off. One of them even pulled me aside, voice low and firm, warning me that if I kept letting this consume me, I'd end up like Hale. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him until he understood that Hale's fate wasn't madness. It was a trail, one that demanded to be followed. Instead, I nodded, pretending to listen, while inside me the fire burned hotter. If no one else believed me, then I'd go alone. And so I did. Patrol after patrol, I pushed deeper, ignoring my scheduled routes, letting the trail of symbols and scraps of evidence dictate my path. My maps became more chaotic, a spiderweb of ink across the desert terrain. I stopped logging my excursions properly, fearing oversight from my superiors. My quarters turned into a shrine of sorts. Hale's cup, the fabric, the revolver, the sketches, all laid out in careful arrangement, as though by staring long enough I might summon the truth into being. Nights bled into days, and still the word haunted me. Listen. It came in dreams, it came in waking silence, it came in the hollow ring of each bootstep on stone. And the more I listened, the more I realized that what haunted Hale wasn't just out there in the desert. It was here, too. In the walls of the station, in the empty bunks, in the space between breaths. Something had followed him, or perhaps he had stumbled into something so vast that it lingered long after he vanished. One evening, as the sun bled red across the mountains, I stood outside the station with Hale's revolver in my hand. I turned the weapon over, fingers brushing the worn grip, and whispered into the empty air. What did you see, Hale? What were you shooting at? The desert gave no answer. But in the silence that followed, I thought I heard something else, a faint rhythm beneath the wind, like a heartbeat too slow and too deep to belong to any man. It lasted only a moment, then vanished, leaving me trembling with the knowledge that I had finally begun to hear what Hale had heard. And once you hear it, you can't turn it off. You can't unlisten. I knew then that my search had only just begun, and that whatever truth lay ahead would demand more than maps and artifacts. It would demand a piece of me, just as it had demanded a piece of Hale. And though fear coiled in my gut like a living thing, I was ready to give it. By the 5th month of my search, I was no longer just a ranger patrolling his assigned routes. I was a man chasing ghosts across a desert that had grown stranger with each passing day. My colleagues avoided me now, their conversations falling silent whenever I entered the room. They saw the hollow look in my eyes, the way I lingered over maps and stared into the horizon as though waiting for it to blink first. To them, I had become another story, another warning about what obsession can do to a man in Big Bend. But they didn't understand. They hadn't found Hale's camps. They hadn't seen the words carved into stone. They hadn't felt the silence shift and breathe like a living thing. I carried those experiences alone, and they had changed me in ways no man could put into words. One evening, I set out with more supplies than I had ever carried before. A full pack of water, rations for a week, extra ammunition, and my notebook thick with sketches of the symbols. I had traced their path across my maps, and though the trail twisted like a snake through the canyon, I believed it was leading me toward a single destination. A place where Hale had made his final stand. The revolver, the empty chambers, the frantic carvings, they were all fragments of a story that ended somewhere deeper, darker. And I was ready to find it. The others didn't ask where I was going, didn't even meet my eyes as I left. In their silence, I felt the weight of their judgment, but also their relief. If I vanished like Hale, at least my obsession would go with me. The desert greeted me with its usual cruelty, heat that scorched the skin, light that blinded, silence that pressed like a fist against the ears. But I welcomed it. Each hardship felt like a test, one I had to endure to walk the same path Hale had. Days passed in a blur of dust and sweat. I followed the symbols where they appeared, scratched on rocks, etched into tree bark, stacked in cairns that seemed too deliberate to be chance. The trail wound deeper into the canyon, into places even the maps marked only as blank spaces. I slept beneath cliffs that rose like cathedral walls, their shadows stretching long and black across the sand. I woke to coyotes calling in the night, their howls echoing like laughter. And always, the symbols pulled me onward, like breadcrumbs left by a man who knew he was being hunted. On the 4th day, I stumbled upon something that nearly brought me to my knees. At the mouth of a narrow ravine, half hidden beneath fallen rock, lay a boot. Weathered, torn, sun-bleached, but unmistakably part of a ranger's uniform. I crouched beside it, trembling, brushing away the dust. My breath caught. Inside the boot was a small scrap of paper, crumpled and fragile with age. I unfolded it carefully, hands shaking so badly I feared I'd tear it apart. The note was barely legible, the ink smeared and faded, but I could make out enough to freeze my blood. Not alone. They hear. 6 won't stop them. I sat there for what felt like hours, the note clutched in my hands, the desert pressing in around me. 6 won't stop them. 6 shots. 6 chambers. Hale had emptied his revolver, and even then, whatever he faced had not been stopped. The thought hollowed me out, left me cold despite the burning sun overhead. I slipped the note into my notebook, the paper crackling like brittle bones, and forced myself to move on. If Hale had left this behind, it was meant to be found. It was meant to warn me. But the warning came too late because I was already too deep to turn back. The ravine narrowed as I entered, the walls closing in until the sky was a thin ribbon of light above. The silence grew heavier here, thicker, as though sound itself had been swallowed. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, each thump loud and frantic. The symbols appeared more frequently, carved into both walls, overlapping and chaotic, spirals upon spirals, jagged figures with arms raised. It was as though Hale, or someone, had carved them in desperation, a flurry of frantic motion before the end. And then I found it. Another message, scratched deep into the rock with trembling hands. Listen close. I pressed my palm against the stone, breath shallow. Listen close. To what? I closed my eyes, straining against the silence. And slowly, faintly, I heard it, a low hum, so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. It vibrated against my bones, a resonance that had no source, no direction. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering. The canyon was empty. The sky above was still. Yet the hum continued, steady, alive. I staggered back, nearly tripping over loose stone, and the sound faded as quickly as it had come. My mouth was dry, my skin clammy despite the heat. Had I imagined it? Or had I finally begun to hear what Hale had warned me about? That night, I set camp near the mouth of the ravine, too shaken to push deeper. I lit a fire, though the flames felt feeble against the looming darkness. The shadows seemed to move differently here, stretching and twisting as though alive. I clutched my revolver, finger brushing the trigger, and listened. Every crackle of the fire, every sigh of the wind, every scrape of shifting stone, I catalogued them all, searching for the hum again. Hours passed, and just as sleep threatened to drag me under, I heard it once more. Louder this time, closer. A vibration that seemed to rise from the ground beneath me, making the flames shiver and the air tighten. My skin prickled, and I swore I saw movement in the darkness beyond the firelight, shapes shifting just out of reach, silent and watching. I raised my revolver, hands shaking, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. Only silence. Only the hum, growing deeper, stronger, until it felt like it was inside my chest. And then, as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, and I knew without doubt that I was not alone. Sleep never came. I sat there, revolver in hand, eyes fixed on the darkness until dawn painted the canyon in pale gold. My body was stiff, my mind frayed, but my resolve hardened. Hale had heard the same hum. He had fired his revolver into that same silence. And whatever he had faced, it was waiting for me too. I didn't realize how far into the canyon I had gone until I tried to retrace my steps and found nothing familiar. The path I thought I had marked, the cairns I stacked with my own hands, the chalk on the rocks, all of it was gone, as though the canyon itself had swallowed every trace. The walls seemed higher now, the shadows deeper, and every turn revealed another passage that looked like the last. For the first time, the desert didn't just feel vast, it felt alive, as though it was watching me with a patience older than any man. My compass spun uselessly, my map a tangle of meaningless lines. I was alone, more alone than I had ever been. But I was not without purpose. Hale had come this way, and I was closer now than I had ever been to the truth. The hum came and went, growing stronger with each passing day. At times it was faint, no more than a whisper at the edge of hearing, but then it would swell, vibrating in my chest and teeth, making the very air shiver. I began to notice patterns in it, rhythms that almost formed words, though I could never quite catch them before they faded. Sometimes it came from beneath my feet, sometimes from the canyon walls, and once, terrifyingly, from the air itself, as though the sky had turned into a vast instrument being played by unseen hands. Each time I heard it, I thought of Hale, of his revolver fired into emptiness, and the words he left behind. 6 won't stop them. I carried those words like a curse. Food dwindled. Water ran low. My hands blistered from the rope and stone. My skin peeled and burned, and yet the canyon pulled me deeper. I began to lose track of time. Days and nights bled together into a single blur of heat and shadow. My notebook filled with frantic sketches, symbols, shapes, fragments of words. Some I recognized from Hale's carvings, others I could not recall ever seeing, yet they appeared beneath my hand as though someone, or something, was guiding me. Sleep brought no rest. I dreamed of towering figures without faces, of shadows bending unnaturally, of a gun firing endlessly into silence. When I woke, the echoes of those dreams lingered, as real as the sand beneath my boots. It was on the 7th night that I found the cavern. The entrance yawned from the base of a cliff, half hidden by thorn brush, the air around it colder than the desert night should have allowed. The hum was strongest here, pouring out in steady waves that made my bones rattle. I stood there for hours, revolver in hand, staring into the black mouth of stone. My every instinct screamed to turn back, to flee before I crossed a threshold no man should. But something stronger held me. Hale's note, his revolver, the trail of symbols that led me here. He hadn't left this place willingly. Neither would I. Inside, the cavern walls glistened with moisture, a strange thing in such a dry land. Symbols covered every surface, carved deep into the rock, glowing faintly as though lit from within. Spirals, jagged lines, figures that twisted in ways no human hand should have drawn. My lamp flickered, though there was no wind. My breath fogged, though the air was still. Deeper I went, the hum building until it was no longer sound but sensation, a pulse that rattled every bone in my body. Then I saw them. At first, I thought they were shadows cast by my lamp, stretching long across the cavern floor. But they moved against the light, rising, bending, shifting like smoke given form. Faceless, silent, towering. They stood in a circle around me, and the hum grew deafening, shaking dust from the ceiling, making my teeth ache. My revolver was in my hand before I knew it, arm raised, finger tight on the trigger. The words burned in my mind. 6 won't stop them. But I fired anyway. The shots cracked like thunder, each one swallowed almost instantly by the cavern's pulse. The figures rippled with every blast, bending backward, but never falling. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 empty. The chamber spun uselessly beneath my thumb, smoke curling from the barrel. The hum did not falter. The shadows did not retreat. They closed in, slow and deliberate, their formless limbs stretching toward me. I staggered back, empty revolver shaking in my grip, my breath ragged. And then something changed. The notebook in my pack grew hot, burning against my back. I tore it free, the pages glowing faintly, the symbols I had scribbled pulsing with the same rhythm as the cavern. The figures stopped, their formless heads tilting as though watching. My hand moved on its own, tracing the shapes in the air, copying what I had written. The shadows recoiled, bending away, the hum rising into a sharp, piercing tone that made the stone tremble. My body shook, every nerve aflame, but I could not stop. I traced symbol after symbol, words I did not know, but my hand remembered. The cavern shook. Stones fell. The shadows writhed. And then, with a sound like tearing fabric, they were gone. The silence that followed was worse than the hum. It pressed against me, heavy and final. My revolver lay useless in my hand, my notebook smoking in the dirt. I fell to my knees, gasping, trembling, every muscle weak. And in that silence, I finally understood why Hale had vanished. He hadn't been killed by them. He hadn't been taken. He had chosen to stay, to fight, to hold them back as long as he could. His revolver, empty. His notes, scattered. His warnings, carved into stone. He had left everything behind not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. And now, I stood where he had stood, facing what he had faced. The cavern walls glowed faintly, the symbols pulsing slower now, fading with each breath. I staggered to my feet, revolver limp at my side, notebook heavy in my other hand. I didn't know if I had won, or if I had only delayed what was coming. But I knew this. I could not leave. Not yet. The trail Hale had walked had become mine, and the truth buried in these canyons was far older, far darker than either of us had imagined. So I stayed. I stayed in the silence, in the hum that waited at the edges of hearing, in the shadows that might rise again. I stayed because someone had to. I never truly intended to vanish. Men don't set out to disappear. They step forward chasing a trail and, without realizing it, step beyond the world the rest of us know. That is what happened to Hale, and now, as I sit here in the belly of this canyon, I know it is happening to me. The desert no longer feels like land and stone, it feels like a threshold, and I have crossed it. If anyone ever finds this account, these words carved into my notebook and scattered where they can be, maybe they'll understand why the rangers never came back, why the revolvers lay empty, why our boots rot in the dust while our bodies are nowhere to be found. The days here no longer have measure. I wake when the cavern light pulses, I sleep when the hum grows quiet, but the sun and moon above mean nothing. My body is thinned, my face a mask of bone and stubble, yet I move with a strength that shouldn't be mine. The symbols in the notebook guide me, their meaning growing clearer each time I trace them. They are not just drawings, they are instructions, words, fragments of a language older than the desert itself. Hale had scratched at them in desperation, but I've begun to hear the cadence behind them, the rhythm that bends the air. At times, I think I almost speak with the canyon, though the canyon does not speak in words. It speaks in vibration, in silence, in a hum that has now become part of my blood. I've learned that the shadows are not always enemies. They are watchers, keepers of something buried here. Sometimes they rise at the edge of my fire, silent and still, and if I do not move, they do not either. They only watch. Other times, they shift closer, testing, bending their faceless heads as if to measure how much I understand. They fear the symbols. They recoil from the shapes traced with firelight or scratched in the dirt. But they never truly leave. They linger like the memory of a storm, waiting for the moment when I falter. I think this was Hale's fate, to hold them back as long as possible, to delay their crossing into the world of men. And now the burden has shifted to me. What gnaws at me most is the knowledge that none of this will be believed. Out there, in the ranger station, in the towns beyond the desert, they'll say I wandered too far, that heat and thirst drove me mad, that my revolver rusts in some crevice while my bones bleach in the sun. They'll whisper the same things they whispered about Hale, that obsession swallowed me, that I lost myself in a wilderness that does not forgive. They will never stand where I am standing now. They will never hear the hum that lives beneath the stone. They will never feel the shadow of something vast move just outside the light. My truth will remain buried here, just like Hale's. I've begun to wonder if the canyon is not merely land, but a wound, a tear between this world and another. The symbols are stitches, old and worn, holding the tear closed. Hale knew it. I know it now. But the stitches fray with time, and when they do, something seeps through. That is why the revolver fired 6 times into silence. Not because he thought he could kill them, but because he wanted to remind himself he was still a man, still capable of action in the face of the unfaceable. I understand him now. The emptiness of my own revolver feels like a mirror. My supplies are nearly gone. Hunger claws at me. Thirst burns my throat, yet I feel tethered here, held not by chains but by a duty that makes escape impossible. If I walk away, who takes my place? Who traces the symbols when they fade? Who listens for the hum when it begins to rise again? There is no relief in this role, only delay, only the desperate act of keeping something contained one more day, one more hour, one more breath. Hale delayed them until his last bullet. I will delay them until I can no longer lift my hand. And after me, perhaps another will stumble onto the trail, find the revolver, hear the hum, and understand what must be done. I realize now that vanishing is not an accident here. It is a requirement. The desert does not let witnesses walk away. It consumes them, hides them, folds them into its silence, so the wider world will never know what waits in the ravines and caverns. I do not resent this fate anymore. I see it as necessary. If the world knew what we faced here, it would come crawling with machines, with greed, with questions that do not deserve answers. Better they think me mad, better they write me off as another ranger lost in the sun. Better the canyon keeps its secret. So here is my last truth. I am still here. I walk the same stone Hale walked. I hear the same hum. I feel the same shadows shifting in the corners of sight. And when my revolver lies empty beside me, when my notebook is nothing but ashes, I will still stand where he stood, in silence, in darkness, in duty. And I will not leave, because some men do not vanish. They are chosen to remain.